When you talk about the American Revolution, there are a few names that really get a reaction, and Banastre Tarleton is definitely one of them. To the British, he was this dashing, heroic cavalry officer, but to the Americans he fought, he was an absolute monster.
Yeah, and that reputation hasn't exactly softened over the centuries. Somebody on a history forum recently put it, well, pretty bluntly, but it kind of nails the general feeling about him today. For a lot of people, Tarleton is just the ultimate bad guy of the war.
And look, this wasn't some nickname made up later on. During the war itself, he was known as Bloody Ban. Especially down in the southern colonies, he became the literal face of British cruelty. The guy whose green-jacketed soldiers, the dragoons, terrified the Patriots.
But here's a thought. What if the real key to understanding Bloody Ban isn't on a battlefield in South Carolina? What if, to really get it, we have to go all the way back to his hometown of Liverpool, England? Because the real story, the one that sets up everything that comes after, it starts right there. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1775. The first shots of the American Revolution have just been fired, thousands of miles away. And back in Liverpool, which is one of Britain's most critical ports, the entire economy is about to just fall off a cliff. See, Liverpool's incredible wealth was built on one single, absolutely brutal industry, the transatlantic slave trade. And the war with America hit that industry like a tidal wave. In just 2 years, the tonnage of slave ships leaving the city plummeted. Ships were just stuck in the harbor, and the city's whole economic engine was just grinding to a halt.
And of course, this had a huge human cost. With all those slave ships just sitting there, not going anywhere, you suddenly had about 3,000 experienced sailors out of work. They're filling the streets, and they are desperate for any way to make a living.
This is the spark that lights the whole fuse. The city's rich merchants, they see all this desperation, and they see an opportunity. So for the few jobs that are still available, they slash the wages by a third, from 30 shillings a month down to 20, basically telling the sailors, hey, take it or leave it, there's plenty more of you. It was a huge gamble, and boy, did it backfire. Things just spun out of control, and fast. First, the sailors start sabotaging the ships, cutting the rigging. Then, when some of them get arrested, thousands of others storm the jail and break them out. And then they grab actual cannons and start firing on the town hall, the center of the merchants' power. It was a full-blown revolt, and it only stopped when the military was called in from Manchester to crush it.
So right in the middle of all this chaos in Liverpool, you have these two totally different groups of guys whose lives are about to crash into the American war. The desperate, angry sailors and a wealthy young aristocrat named, you guessed it, Banastre Tarleton.
And this is the connection that changes everything. See, the Tarleton family wasn't just rich. Their fortune came from the exact industry that had just collapsed and caused the revolt. His father was a huge slave trader, a former mayor. The very merchants who were getting shot at in the town hall, those are his family's people.
So after the revolt gets crushed, the captured sailors are given a pretty stark choice. They can go to trial, which means almost certain prison time, or they can volunteer to join the Royal Navy and go fight the Americans. For them, the war was an escape route born out of pure desperation.
Now, contrast that with Tarleton. That same year, 1775, after he'd basically blown through his inheritance gambling and chasing women in London, he just used his family's money to buy a commission as an officer in a fancy cavalry regiment. For him, the war wasn't a last resort, it was a career move, an adventure funded by slave money.
I mean, the contrast is just staggering, right? On one side, you've got these sailors, unemployed, desperate, pushed into revolting, and then forced into the military just to survive. And on the other side, you have Tarleton, inherits a fortune, wastes it, and then just buys his way into a command position. They both end up in the same war, but man, they could not be coming from more different worlds. So, keeping all of that in mind, let's head back to America and see how this young, ambitious officer from a slave trading family actually built that brutal reputation on the battlefield.
This is what made him infamous. After the Battle of Waxhaws down in South Carolina, the phrase Tarleton's Quarter became a Patriot rallying cry. It literally meant no mercy, because the American story was that his men had slaughtered Continental soldiers after they had tried to surrender. This single event cemented his image as a war criminal. But, like always, this is where the story gets a little more complicated. The Patriot version, the myth, paints him as a monster who ordered the massacre. Tarleton's own account, though, he tells a different story. He claimed his horse was shot out from under him,
pinning him to the ground. His men, thinking he'd been killed under a flag of surrender, just flew into a rage that he couldn't control. So, was it a deliberate massacre? Or was it the chaos of battle fueled by his men's misplaced loyalty? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
So after the war ends and the British lose at Yorktown, you'd probably think Tarleton's story would end in disgrace, right? But it doesn't. And this last chapter of his life brings everything full circle, right back to where we started, Liverpool.
So far from being shamed for his brutal tactics, or, for being on the losing side of the war, Tarleton comes back to England as a celebrated hero. He has his portrait painted by the most famous artist of the day, and he uses that fame to launch a long, successful political career, representing his hometown of Liverpool in Parliament for more than 20 years. He got honors, he was knighted, the whole shebang.
And what did he do with all that political power? Well, as a member of Parliament for Liverpool, Banastre Tarleton became one of the most vocal, aggressive defenders of the British slave trade in the entire country. He spent his career fiercely attacking abolitionists, the very system that funded his commission, the system that sparked that violent revolt back in 1775, that was now his signature political cause.
So was he just the one-dimensional villain we read about in the history books? Or was he something more complicated? A man whose entire life, his fortune, his army career, his political legacy, was completely shaped and defined by the brutal economics of slavery, an economy that made his city rich while it drove other men to rebellion and war. It's a perspective that kind of forces you to rethink the simple story of Bloody Band, doesn't it?